This is the first year that we've done this, so I'm going to call this our first annual because I think this will become something that we'll like to do every year. And to start this, we've got two of the best storytellers that you could ever find in the West. Over here on my left is Apache Adams. Mr. Adams spent his life in the Big Bend country of Texas, generally pretty close to the Rio Grande, and living down on the river. And over here is Mr. Ed Ashurst, and he is California. I'm sorry, I apologize. What's that other state, right? Oh yeah, Arizona. Yeah. Born and raised and worked on every big ranch in Arizona. And both of these men have books over here. They're available. And if you haven't read their books, you need to. They're very entertaining, but I think it'll be more entertaining to hear those stories right straight from them. This is going to be a very informal visiting. I would like to just ask each of them to begin telling their stories. We'll take turns. And just a little bit of background. I was going to show you Apache on the latest Western Horseman. It featured a story on Apache, and he's got a lot of good information about his childhood and several of his stories. And if you have a chance, that's very good reading. Apache lived down there, as I said, in the Big Bend and cowboyed there all his life. He lives in Bront, or outside of Bront, Texas now. Bront and Robert Lee there, which I'm very familiar with that country. When I used to run the spades, one of the spade ranches, Renderbrook Spade, is right to the north of there. But most of these stories and his tales take place in the Big Bend area. Ed has worked on Diamond A's, OROs, Babbitt's, and just about all of the big ranches in Arizona. He currently lives between Douglas, Arizona, and Rodeo, New Mexico, I believe. And as I say, he's written 8 books, and Apache's got a book over here too. And I think at the end of this, you'll want to have some of those books for those stories. I'll start. I'd like to start maybe with Apache. We talked a little bit about what, and I took notes. But maybe one of the first stories that I enjoyed, and you might want to tell them if you would, is the story about you and Oscar breaking colts, and we'll go from there.
I'm not too used to handling one of these things. I get swinging my arms and nobody can hear me. But anyway, I had a big old ranch down south of Alpine at Tulingua, and needed some young horses, and I went to a horse sale and I bought 4 or 5 good young horses, unbroke horses, and I drove up there to the ranch, and Oscar worked for me, and he was there at the pens when I drove up, and we unloaded these colts out of the back of the trailer, and he said, "Patchy," said, "when we start these colts," said, "if you could," said, "I'd love for you to let me have that little red roan horse there from my mother," but said, he was World War II veteran, and he was about 70 years old then, and he said, "If could, I'd got to get you to start him, and I want you to start him my way." Said, "I don't want him to ever pitch anything. I'd love for you to just do it my way." And I said, "Sure." I started nearly all the colts at our place back then, and so this was way before Ray Hunt back in the 50s, and so I 4-footed this colt. We 4-footed him and went to the ground with him, and got a halter on him, tied his foot up, sacked him out a little bit, and put a saddle on him, and I turned him around a time or two, and untied his foot, and stepped on him and trotted him around, and Oscar rode in with a little gray horse, and he dallied up to the saddle horn, and we went out the gate, made a little circle out there, and went out over a pretty steep little old hill, and went across the flat on top, and started off another trail. And just as we started off that trail, old Oscar just throwed that lead rope up in the air as high as he could and squalled and bailed off his horse and scared my horse to death. He blowed up and went pitched off that hill down there. I jee-hawed him around a little bit, got his head picked up, and Oscar come a-trotting up, big grin on his face, and I said, Oscar, what in the world happened? I said, damn, we're going along good, the colt doing good, and said, you just throwed that halter rope at him and jumped off. He said, yeah, Patrick said, I found the prettiest arrowhead you ever seen in your life laying in the trail, and I knew if I rode by it, I'd never find it again. I said, that's good, but I'm riding this colt my way from now on. Heck with you.
I think that shows where Oscar's priorities were. He wasn't that too concerned about Apache. I wanted to ask Ed, I've of course, ranched in Texas and on up into New Mexico and Colorado and up into Montana, but I've never worked out in the Arizona area. And I was wondering if Ed, who is from there, have you ever worked in Texas? Did you ever work in Texas?
Well, no, but I worked with Boots O'Neill and Tom Reeder and Johnny Davenport and Little Boy Brady and Cole Morehouse, so I mean, I'm almost a Texan.
You didn't work in Texas, but you had to work with a bunch of Texans. Well, that's almost as bad. What I'd like to ask you is, what was it like on the OROs, the ROs, like 50 years ago when you were working there?
When I worked at the ROs, it was owned by different people, and there was no management there as far as like a kid. Bill Howell asked a guy one time about a big ranch in Nevada, how do they do things up there? And this kid, he thinks for a while and he says, well, they brand in the spring and ship in the fall. That was about all he had to say. And the RO's, real rough country, big place, lots of water, no wells or pipelines, and the management, when the wagon went out, you packed salt, and you broke horses to ride, and the cattle, there was 2 very large pastures on the ranch. Like one of them was a couple hundred sections, and the other one was about 100 sections, and then another 100 sections or 200 made up into traps, but they didn't wean any calves. In the fall, they might ship a few steer calves, like the bigger ones, but they would not wean any heifers, and most of the calves stayed on the cow. Then in the spring, every day, you made a drive, or in the morning, there is real rough country deal. They worked with what they call a hold-up. The cattle were not wild. People talk about wild cattle, and I've been in a lot of wild cow deals, but it was the type of country you couldn't make a big drive in. And the wagon boss at that time was a legendary wild cow, rough country guy, and would make very small drives, tight drives, men close together, and you'd get a little batch of cattle held up in the bottom of a canyon or whatever, and then you'd move that would be what we'd call the hold up, and you'd move it to another place and make another little drive, and you might make 4 or 5 of them in the morning. Then you'd get your herd thrown together finally, and a big herd at the ROs would be 150 cows. A lot of days we'd work all morning and gather 50. And then the horse wrangler bring us horses. We change horses every day. Whether you needed to or not, you changed horses. And then when you got your horses changed, the cook might bring lunch, or you might wait a little later, but then you'd work a herd and you'd cut those yearlings out. and somebody would hold them out there while you get them cut out. Then a lot of places there would be a corral where we could pin the cows and calves and you'd brand, which you'd get done branding, then that herd of yearlings, and it might be 15 of them, and it might be one time. I remember this one place called Oak Dam, we had about 135 yearlings. That was the biggest bunch of yearlings in the spring I remember, but we'd drive them to wherever our camp was, and there'd be a holding pasture. And those calves would all be weaned, just the mothers would kick them off them, and yet they were following those cows, and they didn't want to leave, and they hadn't really been in. This is a cowboy deal, and we did that every day. Take 70 days in the spring without a day off, you just do that day after day after day. And so they handled the cattle right. When you'd go somewhere, like you'd take off with that bunch of yearlings, generally there might be more men in front of them than behind them holding them up. But you'd have a little trouble once in a while, and you might have to rope. There was a lot of roping. And they had really good horses. And the old wagon boss turned 75 while I worked there. He, nicest old man that ever lived, but he could rope a wild cow and tie her down better than any man on the ranch, 75 years old. But his management, as far as he knew, they still sold cattle by the head, not the pound. You know, he was a good cow man. He knew an old cow. He knew when a cow needed to be sold. But his deal was get the cattle gathered, get them in a trap, and the guy that owned the ranch kind of did the business end of it.
We'll go back and talk some more about some of those other places, but I was going to ask Apache, you told me one time you went into Mexico and gathered some horses. I don't know if that was legal. I don't know if it'd be legal today, but I don't guess that probably mattered a whole lot, did it?
Well, no, I don't think. And, you know, I was raised down there on the river, and it was about belly deep to a horse, and there wasn't no kids there for white kids for us to play with, and the only kid was over in Mexico. My family, and there was a little community across the river. And hell, so I spent about half of my time, or 2/3 of it, across the river over there playing with those kids. We just back and forth across there like it was a stream here in the United States. We didn't pay any attention to the border. And every time I'd learn an English word, well, I learned a Spanish word. I was over there talking to them more than I was to anybody on this side. So that's the way that went. But that horse deal was a neighbor of my dad's, and the Black Gap Game Reserve was belonged by Guy Combs, and my dad had it leased for cattle and horses, and Francis Rooney had it leased for sheep and goats, big animal and little animal lease. And my dad paid 5 cents an acre for it for the big animals, and Francis Rooney paid 5 cents an acre for the sheep and goats. And of course, Francis Rooney run a few horses because he had to have horses working sheep and goats, so they had some horses. Well, one year, instead of leasing the ranch back to Dad and them, well, Guy Combs donated it to the state for a state park, which is a big Black Gap Game Reserve now. And anyway, well, Francis Rooney was trying to pin his horses, and his horses got pretty trotty. He had about 25, 30 head of horses, and they got pretty hard to try to pin. They'd make a circle and bringing them all into the pens, and they got to breaking by. They just send maybe 1 or 2 men out to get horses, and they'd get by them. And so whenever he was moving out and the government was wanting him to get all his horses off, well, he called me, asked me, said, you know that country pretty well down there. Would you mind going gathering those horses? And he said, I'll just pick 2 or 3 horses out I want to keep and give you the rest for gathering them. I said, sure. And so I went down and told my dad what deal I'd made with Francis Rooney, and he said, son, let me tell you, he said, the best way to the world, said, I know those horses, and my dad was really good at gathering wild horses and stuff. He said they've been trying to bring those horses into these pens for 3 or 4 months, and said they've got them spoiled for every time they get up close to pens, they just scatter and go back to the mountains and everything. He said, just go down there and take a couple of boys and ride just as light a saddle as you can get, real light saddle blankets, don't pack any grub, no bedrolls or nothing, just go real light. And said, you get back in there and try to throw all those horses the way they want to go. Just throw them back into those mountains, up that big bluff. And said, just follow that bluff around. Said, those horses, in one day you'll have them about half broke. Said, you can hit that river with them, take them right up the river. And it was about 18, 20 miles from Francis Rooney's up to my dad's place. So I did, and me and those 2 Mexican boys that worked for me, Simone and Graviel, Dad said, just take as light of groceries as you can. So we put 3 potatoes a day, put 9 potatoes for 3 days. We put in a little morale on our saddle and had our ropes, and that was about it. And we took off that morning and rode down there to Marville, and we'd seen where the horses was running and everything. And that night we just dug a little hole and put 9 potatoes in it. And the next morning, each one of us had 3 cooked potatoes, and we'd put 2 of them in the morale. 1 was for breakfast, 1 was for lunch, and 1 was for supper that night. And then we put 3 more potatoes in, so we call it 3 potato trip. And anyway, we throwed those horses into those bluffs, and those horses went drifting around, going back up the river, come into one of the bluffs come into the river, and big canebrakes and deal, and those horses just trotted right in there and hit that river and went right up that river. And we never had a horse to turn back. We took them all the way, 2 days, we took them about 18 miles around into the ranch and pinned them. And that's the way we did that, but Dad helped us with getting them.
That always reminds me, it seems like about the time I start calling a cow or a horse stupid is right after he just out-thought me. Yeah. And that's where you out-thought a horse, I mean. One thing I was wanting you to talk about, Ed, well, let me preface it by saying this. I guess one of the, or probably the most well-known managers of the big Babbitt ranches was a fellow named Bill Howe, and he's pretty legendary. And as far as his management of cattle and management of a ranch. And I'd like to also point out that we've got 2 of his sons here, Vic Howe, who manages the Babbitts now, and then Tom Howe. They're both here, and both are a testament to their dad's abilities and what he taught them. But I'd love for you to tell these folks something about Bill and the way he could handle cattle and the way he did handle big bunches of cattle.
When I was a kid starting out punching cows in northern Arizona, the Whistle Mills, who run the wagon at the Oros, he is a very famous guy. I got another friend here I was trying to kid a while ago, and he's kind of bowed up mad, but Jimmy Dolan. His dad, Tom, run the wagon at the Diamond A's. He was a legendary old cowboy guy, very, very well liked and very well respected guy. And he retired about the time I started punching cows, but Bill Howell was he was very well known. He could ride a bucking horse like nobody. I mean, I worked for Bill for 15 years, and their horses now are the best there is. But when I went there, a lot of guys wouldn't work there because they were hard to ride. I worked for him 15 years. I never saw the man get bucked off. But he was, a lot of people think, or under the misconception, in my opinion, people nowadays, certainly not old timers, but think that handling big bunches of cattle is easy. It's the wild cattle that are hard. And handling a bunch of wild cows is one thing, but handling large herds of especially cows and calves, there's an art to that. And there's a lot of guys that have tried to run big ranches that were not very, there's a right way and the wrong way to do everything. And Bill was a master at handling large bunches of cattle. I never saw Bill get himself in a situation that he couldn't get out of. And I've run big ranches, and that's hard to do. You can find yourself getting yourself into a situation, you got too many cattle, you got too far to go, you just get in a wreck, and it just didn't happen to him. In the spring, the one ranch at Babbitt's, there's a couple ranches, but the one you move cattle up and down 50, 60 miles every year, up in the spring, down in the fall, and would move cows and babies, and Bill was fanatic about, you'd gather a little bunch of cows and you'd get them cows moving, and after you went a ways, you'd pair them out, which sounds like, golly, that'd take all day. Get 150 cows thrown together and make sure each cow and calf is paired up, and if there's one that isn't paired up, you turn them back. But he had worked them cattle, and them cattle were kind of trained. He'd keep them moving, and a couple of guys that better hands would get up in front of them cattle and just let them go. And anything that wasn't straight, they'd turn them back. And he'd do stuff like that other people I hadn't seen done. And a lot of guys, it would put a lot of pressure on you. If you were up there with him, he was inspirational. He was so good, but he could also be very hard on you if you didn't know what you were doing. He wasn't always nice, but if you were a good hand and you could help him, you could feel his appreciation. And some guys didn't want to be up there. It's like, I don't like that. That's a pressure deal. I thought this is the funnest thing I've ever done. You'd get them cows going, and you'd be ducking and diving and stopping a cow and letting another, and it made you think. You had to think, and Bill Howell had a 7th grade education. He couldn't spell a 4-letter word. He left me a note one time giving me instructions, and Vic was there, and the note was turn the cattle loose. And he spelled trun, T-R-U-N. But the guy was a genius. He had a natural business head on him. He knew how to run a ranch, and he knew how to, but he was a thinker. The guy was a thinker, and he didn't just blunder into stuff. You did stuff right. And if you didn't do it right,
I see Tom and Vic laughing. I think they've been there a time or two. I heard one time, one of the best sayings I've heard, we got to talking about a few years ago, things are changed. You have to run a ranch like a business now. You can't just do like you used to do. You've got to run a ranch like a business. And I heard one of the best definitions, or what I feel like is a truer axiom, is this: ranching is not a business. Ranching is an art form that needs to be handled in a business-like manner. And when you see somebody handling cattle like that, you're getting a lot more done in a day with a lot less stress on the cattle, but that wasn't handling it in a business-like way. It was in an artful way that led to the optimal business results. just because you knew how to handle cattle and how to handle men and how to handle horses. Patchy, tell us another story. You pick one.
I had a big old ranch lease down there south of Alpine. Well, it was really south of Marathon. They called it the Pope Ranch. It was 300 sections. It was exactly 10 miles wide, and it was exactly 30 miles long. And we had a camp. My wife and I lived in the camp about halfway, right about the middle of it, and had a 20-section pasture just east of the house there, about 7-8 miles. We had a horse trap and then the 20-section pasture. And I had a bunch of high school boys. I always tried to work during the spring break, and I'd take those 17, 18-year-old boys with me. Joyce said I'd look kind of like John Wayne and the Cowboys, and I'd take those boys, and they, you know, they were kind of from town, but they were good hands and wanting to work. And anyway, well, we was leaving the house there one morning going to work this 20-section pasture, and I heard all those boys back behind me doing stuff, and I didn't know what it was, but there's a giggling and a laughing back there. And I just kept trotting. Me and a couple of Mexican boys that was working for me, we just kept trotting in a pretty long trot going to the backside. And in a minute, well, those boys, I heard them coming up behind me, and they dropped a red racer snake around my neck. And boy, howdy, I mean, I didn't know whether it was a rattlesnake or what it was. I went to fight my head, and I finally slung that thing off, and my horse blowed up, and I got him rode and everything, and I kind of looked, I said, boys, y'all need to kind of settle down. I said, y'all gonna get somebody hurt. I said, don't do that anymore, and trotted on off. One of these boys he had graduated the year before, and he kind of study hand for me, Johnny Delaney. And I didn't say nothing to him, but he was the instigator. And anyway, well, we worked cattle that day, and we put all the cows with big calves in a little shipping trap. We was going to ship in about 4 days, and come up to shipping day. Well, Johnny Delaney was riding a little bronc mare that he was riding from my brother, and the pitching was really pretty mean to ride. And we was trotting along there about just good daylight, and I looked over at Johnny, and I seen he had a hackamore on this little mare, but he just had a headstall on, didn't have a throat latch on this hackamore. And I looked over at that, and I just kind of reached over and grabbed that halter and jerked it off, slapped it off of her nose, and that horse blowed up and went to pitching with me, messing with her. She took off. He had the reins around her, right around her neck, and riding just like that hard as he could. And we went ahead and made the circle, and we pinned him with all that bunch of cows, and come trotting by me, and I slapped him on the back, and I said, Johnny, payback's a bitch, ain't it?
Ed, I was wanting to ask you, you were on the Diamond A's in the early 70s, I think. Isn't that right? How many cattle did they run when you were there?
I went back there. I worked there the fall of 72 and 73, and then I went back the fall of 92, and I ran the wagon there myself 3.5 years. When I was there before, they had 2 other ranches leased, one on the west end and one on the east side that connected. So it was about 1,500 sections. When I went back there, it was like 1,170 sections. But in all 3 of those ranches, the fall of 1972, they liquidated the Hereford cow herd that had been there forever. And that was the first time I worked there. The next year, I ran Mexican steers on it. And the brand inspector there that was there when I went back 20 years later to run the wagon, he told me the final sanitary board, they call it, brand inspector inspection count was over 17,000 cows. I don't think, honestly, prior to it happened, I don't think they knew how many they had. They didn't care. The Diamond A's was like when they'd brand every 10th bag or every 10th year, they'd just throw them away. I mean, they'd brand 10% more than what they were even. Big was good. Big was good. So there's lots of cows.
How did it change so much between when you were there in the 70s and in the 90s? Was it still pretty much the same, or had it changed quite a bit?
Yeah, it was a totally different deal when I went back there. When I left there, there was 10,500 cows there, was my tally. There was probably about 9,000 the fall I went there. But it's a little different. Well, true story. I showed up there, they did not give me a tally book. They did not know how many cows they had. They just said, there it is. Basically was all that was said to me. It took me 2 years, but we did get a very accurate count on what was there. But they hadn't sold a cull cow there in years. They just let them die. And I went there, and there's lots of old cows there, and I asked the guys that own outfits, you want me to cut some of these old cows to sell them? And they looked at me like, wow, you know what an old cow is? And I thought that's why you hired me. But is a little different. But they hadn't, in the 20-year period, for whatever reason, I don't know, they had not been, I started throwing big roundups together and sorting cattle outside, which is the only way, I mean, that's how I knew how to do it. And we throwed a big roundup together out there, and I was going to cut cows and have a guy out there holding the cut and everything, and everybody's like, wow, this hadn't been done here since 1972. And so there was a lot of, that's one of the differences I see in a lot of ranches now. People don't work cattle out much. People go to a corral and they run their cows down the chute and look in their mouth, and that's how they cull their cows. And I had guys like Bill Howell or Whistle Mills or whoever, Tom Dolan. I mean, they could ride through a herd of cows and look at a cow and tell how old she was just by looking at her. And that's how they cut their cull cows and you work cattle outside. And people don't do that as much anymore.
Yeah. So. That's going back to what we were talking about, where you've gone away from you don't spend as many hours in your cattle as you used to, and you've gone away from some of that knowledge of what that you can do visually, and because we can do so much more by running them through a chute and a nice set of pins, and it's taken away some of that. I don't know what you'd call it, but some of that natural ability to sort cattle. One thing I was going to say, if you have any questions, please just raise your hands and ask them of either one of these two guys and not of me. But we'd be glad to take any questions. And if any of you have any embarrassing stories on either of these guys, we'd love for you to share those with us too. Patchy, if you would tell us one more story, I'd appreciate it.
Okay, I'm going to tell a story about that fella in the yellow shirt and hat over there. He's the one that wrote my book, but I took him a few miles with me. But I was contracted out to the USDA to gather any Mexico cattle coming across the river in the Big Bend Park and well, nearly from El Paso to Del Rio. that if the USD found a bunch of cattle on this side of the river, well, they'd call us, and I'd put a crew together, and we'd go try to gather them. And with no pens, we're going to have to rope everything. If it's a milk cow, well, we rope turn loaded her. If it's a wild brimmer bull, rope him, loaded him too. And anyway, well, they called me one morning and said that one day and said there's a bunch of cattle up there on Green River, right below Van Horn, Texas, and crossing the river there. And so Don was living in Austin, about Dripping Springs, about that time, and I called him. I said, "You want to go on a wild cow hunt in the morning this week?" I said, "We're going to go down and gather these cows." Yeah. Well, he showed up, and we got up that morning and had a Mexican boy working for me, really good cook, and I mean, he fixed us a bunch of tortillas and beans and everything. We got up about 4 and saddled up, and I had a new horse that we hadn't rode very much, and I told Don, I said, "Don, this is a pretty big, good, stout horse, and we got to rope something." I said, "You saddle him up this morning." He said, "All right." So we took off, trotted up about 4 or 5 miles up, and just about to break daylight, I told Don, I said, "Let's lope up on that hill and let it get daylight, and those cattle will be coming out of that river break, out of those cane breaks down there. Maybe we can get a run at them." So we hit a lope, started up that hill, and his horse blowed up and went to pitching, and I mean, spinning and pitching and really pitching. Don finally got him rode and looked around, he's lost his hat. He said, "Patsy, would you get off and get my hat for me?" And I said, "No, Don, I'm not going to do that." I said, "That was the ugliest bronc ride I ever seen, and I think if I wait a few minutes, I might get to see another one just like it."
Well, Ed, here we're coming. He wants to defend himself on this.
Yeah, let me see. You said you offered to do anything.
Yeah, take your shot. You bet.
So, Patsy and I had Pico Canyon South Market.
I want to ask you to tell the college boy story next, and I think that'd be a good one to end it on, don't you?
Give you an idea. Patsy and I had another 100 cows out there. Before the beginning came, we rode all day and changed horses at noon, and we gathered 7 cows. I mean, it was rough. And anyway, we went to the grocery store to buy groceries for this crew. Well, you can imagine going to the grocery store with him, what it must be like. So anyway, he's picking all these little packages and lunch meat. He's got the whites. You don't even know this. You don't want to know this. He's throwing the basket, and I'm handing the bag out. I said, "Patsy, there's a deli over there. We're going to cook fresh meat." So we go over here. I know that guy said, "Cut us a pound of ham and a pound of turkey for sandwiches." And Patsy, we all got nobody in the grocery store here. We said, "Turkey, we don't want no turkey. Give us a ham. We're in the cow business."
I think we're probably getting about to when we ought to wrap it up, but I did want to ask Ed if he would tell us one more story about some college boys.
This is a true story that happened to a friend of mine, but I know all the parties involved. And I got a friend, one of the most interesting guys I've ever known, good friend of mine. I worked with him 45 years ago, and we're still friends, named Dave Shapiro. And Dave, would just say he's a real character, real smart guy. And he was in Prescott on Whiskey Row long in September, I think of about 1975, looking for a job, and he runs into this cowboy named Jerry Brashears. And they in the Palace Bar, and Dave says, "Yeah, I need a job." And Jerry says, "Well, come on with me. We'll go up to X Bar 1, and I'm sure Mike Landis will give you a job." Mike Landis is this character who he learned to punch cows here in Texas, worked at the JA's with Boots O'Neill in 1949, worked at the upper lower Matadors, worked with, I think he worked with Buster and a lot of really famous Texans. Migrated to Arizona, very good guy. I worked for him 3 times. Very opinionated, very eccentric. And so Dave follows Jerry Brashears up there, and they go to work at this outfit called the X-Bar 1. And they're camped off out in the boonies there, sleeping in teepees and cooking in Dutch ovens. And they're sitting around the fire one night, about 5-guy crew, five or 6 men. And they're telling stories. And Landis, who smoked Bull Durham cigarettes, he's sitting there with his back to the fire. And these young guys are all talking. And they get to talking about the ROs, which is like the crown jewel of Arizona. And one of them says, man, that RO outfit, I'd sure like to work there someday. Man, they say that's a good outfit. And this other guy says, yeah, I guess old Mike McFarland's running the wagon there. And another one says, yeah, that Mike McFarland's, he's a good hand. And one of them says, Mike, did you ever work with Mike McFarland? No, but I heard he's a good feller and a pretty darn good hand. And this other kid says, that Mike McFarland's smart. He's been to college. And Landis jumps up and goes, I'll tell you fellers one thing. If he's been to college, he sure as heck ain't no cowpuncher. And Dave has been to college, and he jumps back in the shadows. He's saying, have I told anybody I've been to college? And he kind of hides, and he can't remember saying he had been to college, so he slips back in the fire, and he keeps his mouth shut for a while, and he's hoping nobody finds out. So they go through the roundup, and they get back to the headquarters, and they're camped there, and there's this big steel water storage, big water trough between the house and the bunkhouse, and deer hunters have shot it through it full of holes, and different cowboys have sharpened sticks and pounded in the holes, and it won't hold no water no more. And Landis had just taken over running the outfit, and he needed to get him a new water storage. And it had a metal plate welded on it with the manufacturer's name and phone number. So Dave's in the house with the crew eating lunch, and he hears Landis get on the phone, and he hears this conversation. Hello, this is Mike Landis here at the X-Bar 1 Ranch in Sligman, Arizona, and I need to order a new water storage. Okay, this girl on the, okay, we can do that. Want it just like the one we got here? Okay, we can do it. How many gallons is it? By golly, I don't know how many gallons it is. Just make it like the one that's here. Says you made it. That's fine, sir. We can do that, but we have no record of that. How big do you want it? Just make it like the one that's there. I don't know how big it is. Well, you have to tell us how many gallons it is. He slams the phone down. They're done working. It's about Thanksgiving, and he tells Dave Shapiro he's going to lay Dave off, but he's going to keep Jerry through the winter. He tells Dave, you ain't had no time off, so just stay up there in the bunkhouse till the first of the month, and I'll pay you and you'll just be like days off, and we'll feed you and take care of you for like 4 or 5 days. Okay, so Dave, he's hanging out up there, and the next day he looks down there, and here's Landis, the boss, and he's got high-top, fancy Jesse Bogle boots and great big silver-mounted spurs and real punchy hat, and he's got Jerry Brashears, and they climb up over into this storage that's dry because they don't want, and they have a step ladder, a folding step ladder, and they have a wooden ruler that's 12 inches long, and they climb up on the step ladder, starting at one edge of the deal, and they hold it up. And then they get down, they move the step ladder over through 4 or 5 foot, and they climb up. And Landis, he's got him a piece of paper. And so 4 or 5 days go by, and Dave's going to leave 1st of December the next day, and Landis tells him, By golly, Dave, you're leaving tomorrow. Come on down to the house tonight and eat supper with Haru and I. Okay. So he goes down there, and Landis's wife was a Japanese lady, nicest lady that ever lived, Japanese gal. He met her overseas when he was in the Air Force, right before he went AWOL. He walks in, and Haru's got a nice, she's a good cook, she had a nice dinner cooked about 6 o'clock. And Landis is sitting at the kitchen table, and he's sitting there, he's left-handed, and he's got him a yellow legal pad and a pencil about that long that's been sharpened with a pocket knife, and he's got his hat off. And about every 30 seconds, he'd rip a page out of there and crumple it up and throw it, and the floor was just full of crumpled up yellow paper. And Dave sits down, and they eat supper, and Mike, he's just figures and then rips a piece of paper off, crumbles it, and he don't say nothing. And they sit, him and Haru eat. Mike don't touch the food. They get done eating. Haru goes in, brings out a fresh baked apple pie, and gives Dave some coffee. Mike ain't said nothing. Finally, Dave gets up, pushes his chair back, and says, "Well, Mike, I guess I'll be going." And Mike finally just, "By golly, Dave, I'm sorry. Darn, you're a nice feller, and I ain't said nothing to you all night. I'll tell you, Dave, this water story just got me bumfuzzled. I'm just embarrassed, because you're a nice feller, and I ain't said nothing to you all night, but this water story's got me messed up." And Dave says, "Want me to help you?" "Well, I guess so." Dave, he walks up, pulls out a chair, sits down. Radius squared times pi times the height times 7.5, puts a piece of paper across there. Your water storage is 10,000 gallons, Mike. "Okay." And Dave walks to the door, and just as he puts his handle on the door to walk outside, Mike's, "Hey, Dave!" "Yeah? You ever been to college?"
You want another one? Joy and I was working for the KCs, and went into, was going to town, going to WRCA, going to Pecos really to a country western dance. They had a TNT dance. It was Ernest Tubbs and Conway Twitty, and they called it the TNT dance. And I was 20 years old and at the ranch, and I come into WRCA, and I bought a beer there at the little beer joint, and boy come driving up. That's during the Korean War. Well, it was 61 years ago. And anyway, well, he said he was trying to get to Fort Stockton, and looking for a ride to get to Fort Stockton. He had to go back to Korea in a few days, and I said, "Well, hop in, I'll take you down there." I said, "I'll do that." I was 20 years old, 19 years old. And anyway, well, we did. I took him to Fort Stockton and dropped him off, and run into an old friend of mine. He said, "Well, Patsy, let's run down here to Dixie Dog, and we'll get a hamburger or something." So we did, and real pretty little blonde-headed gal come up there and waiting on us. And I said, "Say, I'm going to dance in 21 Club in Pecos." Said, "Would you like to go?" She said, "No," but said, "I'll go to dance with you here in Fort Stockton." Said, we went to the dance, and then every weekend after that for about 40 days, well, I was in town visiting that little blonde-headed gal, and on the 21st of September, we went to a movie. It was Bus Stop with Marilyn Monroe, and this boy, they was in a snowstorm or something, and anyway, well, he had said something about, said, "We ought to just go get married." I looked over to Joy. I said, "That's a pretty good idea. What do you think?" She said, "I think so." We went to Mexico and got married, and she had never boiled coffee. She was 17 years old, junior in high school, senior in high school, and never boiled coffee, didn't know how to cook nothing or anything. I took her 52 miles north of Toya, Texas, on the Delaware Rim, right under that Gomez Peak, and to the right. Hired her out for, I was kind of lead off hand. I hired her out for $50. I was getting $125. Made a cook out of her, and she cooked for us for a little while. And I hired a boy to help her cook. He was a windmill man in the fit builder, but a pretty good cook. He taught her how to make biscuits and make gravy mainly. And anyway, she cooked there for us for about a month, and she said, "Come in." I come in one day, and she said, "Patsy," said, "you know, we've ate beef every day. She said, "I would love a piece of some chicken or something different than just beef and beans." I said, "Okay." I said, they had a few old roosters and hens running around the yard there all the time. I said, "I'll kill a couple of roosters in the morning and wait till they get on the mesquite tree out there. They'll roost on it, and I'll catch them about 4 o'clock in the morning when we started saddling up. We was doctoring lots of screw worms. I ran out there and caught 2 of those roosters and wrung their neck and laid them on a barrel. And I went in the house and I told Joy, I said, "Joy," I said, "I left you a couple of chickens out there on the barrel. You can fix them for us for lunch, and then the boys will be back in about 2 o'clock this evening for lunch." She said, "All right." And so we all took off and doctored the screw worm, made a big circle, and come back in about 2 o'clock. And I looked up there on that barrel, and the chickens were about that big around, swelled up. And I walked in the house and I said, "Joy," I said, "how come you didn't fix them chickens?" She said, "Oh, they still got feathers and guts in them." No, yeah.
You know, you reckon that marriage is going to last or not? You think?
Do what?
You think maybe that marriage will last? I think it probably
61
will.
years.
61 years. That's wonderful. Well, folks, we sure enjoyed y'all being here, and I want you to know that a lot of these stories you've heard, you need to treasure, because we're not hearing them near as much as we need to. These books are for sale here, and Ed has said that if you want a book and you'll write a check and make it out to the Working Ranch Cowboys Foundation, he'll donate all those proceeds to the foundation. And I really appreciate these 2 men being here and sharing their life stories with us, and I think we need to offer them a big round of applause. Thank you.
That was a great deal.
That was. You bet.
Thank you all for being here. We started something this year that we don't go on a very long time, and it'll be a legends program. And we're searching far and wide for people that are true legends and cowboy legends. These are our first 2, and I know both of you are. You truly are legends. We want you to be able to walk away from here with something that says that. Now, we know you're pretty humble, so these folks we are unique, and these
Yeah, we thank you. My goodness.
that we give these legends. It's got our logo on it, and in very small print it says legend. So if they look at you closely, anybody will know.
Thank you. Appreciate it.